Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to dive into something pretty interesting. It's the link between societal inequalities and brain health. So we've got two sources for this deep dive. One is a press release about a brand new perspective piece in Nature Neuroscience. And it's all about pushing for more diversity in brain research.
Right.
And then we've also got this newsmedical.net article, and they're covering a study in Nature Aging that found a connection between societal inequality and brain aging and dementia. Pretty wild, right? It's like income inequality can actually impact the physical structure of our brains.
Yeah, we usually think about brain health as like genetics and lifestyle, but these sources are really highlighting these larger societal forces at play.
Okay, so let's start with the Nature Neuroscience piece. It says that things like sex and gender and race and ethnicity and economic status all impact our brain biology and behavior. But a lot of the current research is using a very specific demographic: Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, or weird for short.
Right. And the problem is those findings might not apply to everyone. It's like you're trying to understand the whole world, but you're only looking at one country. You're going to miss out on a lot of important stuff.
Right. Yeah, and I imagine missing that information can have real consequences.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about mental illnesses. They can manifest so differently across different groups if the research doesn't capture those nuances. The diagnoses and treatments could be way off.
Wow, that's scary. So this Nature Neuroscience piece is really pushing for more diversity in all parts of the research, from choosing participants to gathering data to analyzing the results. There's this one detail that really got me: Dr. Domela's research showing that sex and gender identity can actually influence brain activity, especially in the areas related to social cognition and emotional processing.
Oh, yeah. That's a really good example of why this stuff is so important. Treatments developed from research. That doesn't account for those differences. They could be less effective or even harmful.
Right. Okay. So let's move on to that global study that was reported in newsmedical.net. So they found that higher levels of societal inequality, which is measured by something called the GNI index, are linked to reduced brain volume and altered connectivity, which is kind of alarming.
But is that permanent? Like, can those changes be reversed if societal conditions improve?
That's a great question. And it's something that researchers are still looking into.
Yeah.
But what we do know is that these effects are especially strong in Latin America, which has historically high levels of inequality. And this study focused on two types of dementia: Alzheimer's disease and frontotemporal lobar degeneration. And they saw that Alzheimer's patients in societies of more inequality had more severe brain impacts, which suggests that environmental stressors might be making the neurodegeneration worse.
Where you live and the level of inequality around you could be shaping your brain's health.
It is a sobering thought. Now, the impact on frontotemporal lobar degeneration was milder, which suggests a stronger genetic component to that condition. Okay, you mentioned epigenetics earlier, so that's how our experiences can change, how our genes work.
Right. So we're saying that inequality can literally get woven into our DNA?
Exactly what we're talking about. It's fascinating, but also a little unsettling to think about how deeply societal factors can influence us. It's fascinating, but also a little unsettling to think about how deeply
societal factors can influence us.
So how does that actually happen? How does living in an unequal society translate to changes in our brains?
Well, one major pathway is through chronic stress. So if you live in a society with high levels of inequality, you're more likely to experience things like poverty, discrimination, violence, or lack of access to quality education and healthcare. And those are all significant stressors.
Okay, so it's like being in a constant state of fight or flight.
Right.
But instead of a tiger, it's like systemic disadvantages. They're the threat. And we know that chronic stress is linked to all sorts of health problems. So it's also playing a role in brain health.
Oh, absolutely. Over time, this chronic stress can really harm the brain. Studies show that. Prolonged exposure to stress hormones can actually damage brain cells, especially in areas like the hippocampus, which is crucial for learning and memory. It can even impair the formation of new brain cells, a process called neurogenesis.
So chronic stress is bad news for our brains. What about other ways that societal inequality might be getting under our skin? You mentioned inflammation before.
Right. Inflammation is another key pathway. We usually think of inflammation as our body's response to injury or infection, but it can also be triggered by psychological and social stressors. And research is showing that people who experience chronic discrimination or social exclusion tend to have higher levels of inflammation in their bodies.
Okay, so it's like the body is on high alert even when there's no physical danger present. But how does that relate to the brain?
Well, over time, this chronic inflammation can damage blood vessels and tissues.
And throughout the body.
Including in the brain, and it's been linked to an increased risk of neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's.
So we've got chronic stress and chronic inflammation, both fueled by societal inequalities. Are there any other factors at play here?
Yeah. There's also the impact of epigenetics, which adds another layer of complexity here. It's the idea that our experiences, especially early in life, can actually change how our genes function.
Right. So even if your DNA doesn't change,
Yeah.
the way it's expressed can be altered by your environment.
Exactly. Think of it like a dimmer switch on a light. Your experiences can turn certain genes up or down. So for instance, children who grow up in poverty or experience neglect may have altered gene expression. That makes them more vulnerable to stress and inflammation later in life.
Wow. So the inequalities we face early on can literally shape our genes and have a ripple effect on our brain health throughout our lives.
Here's where it gets really interesting. These epigenetic changes can be passed down to future generations, which perpetuates the cycle of inequality and its impact on brain health.
That's pretty heavy, but also maybe a little bit hopeful. Because if negative experiences can have such a lasting impact, then maybe positive experiences can too.
Yeah, that's a great point. And there's growing evidence that interventions focused on creating those positive experiences, like early childhood education and parenting support programs, can promote positive epigenetic changes.
Okay, so this is all pretty complex, but what I'm hearing is that while individual choices do matter, they're only part of the story. If we want to tackle brain health equity, we need to look at the bigger picture.
Absolutely. It requires a multi-level approach, one that considers individual, interpersonal, community, and societal factors.
So while we can make healthy choices as individuals, it sounds like individual action can only go so far. What about interventions at the community and societal level?
Right. So at the community level, we can focus on creating environments that support brain health. Things like improving access to quality education, affordable healthcare, healthy food options.
And green spaces. Access to nature can improve cognitive function and reduce stress.
Exactly. And then at the societal level, we need policies that address the root causes of inequality, poverty, discrimination, lack of opportunity. We need to advocate for policies that promote economic justice, social inclusion, and equal access to education and healthcare.
So it sounds daunting, but it also feels hopeful, like we can use our voices, vote for change, get involved in our communities to push for a more equitable world.
Yeah, it's about shifting the narrative and challenging the systems that perpetuate inequality. It's about creating a culture that values fairness, compassion, and the well-being of all its members.
I think this brings up another important point. Research, we've talked about a lot of the negative impacts. But what about the positive side? What can research tell us about? The social and environmental factors. That can actually boost brain function and resilience?
That's a great question. And an area where I think more research is definitely needed. But we do know that. Things like social support and a sense of purpose can be incredibly protective. You know people who have strong social networks and feel connected to something bigger than themselves, they tend to have better cognitive function and a lower risk of dementia.
So it's not just about the number of social interactions, but like the quality of those connections. Feeling truly supported and valued by others seems to have a real impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And finding your passion, something that gives you a sense of purpose, can make you more resilient when you're facing challenges, you know? It really shows how connected our mental, emotional, and physical well-being really are.
This has been eye-opening. It's made me realize that brain health isn't just about what we do as individuals. It's about the world we create together.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's about recognizing that deep connection between brain health and societal well-being and working together to create a world that really nourishes our minds and fosters a more just and equitable future.
I think this conversation is going to stick with me for a while. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. And to all our listeners out there, keep those brains buzzing.